Hi there, Tara here with Quilts Plus Love. I've gotten a lot of questions from you recently, and as you can see, I'm building a couple mini series outside of the memory quilting and t-shirt quilting realm because I've had a lot of people, you purchase the pattern and you want to make your own memory quilt. You may want to make your own t-shirt quilt, but you don't actually quilt yet, and you've never maybe done this before. And so you have a lot of questions, and when it comes to your memory quilt, or when it comes to those special t-shirts, you only get one shot. And I appreciate that, I understand that. So if you're in that spot where you wanna make your own memory quilt or t-shirt quilt, I highly encourage that you do a couple practice projects first. And what I'm gonna talk about today, 5 ways to quilt your quilt. This is gonna be a mini series. I'm gonna give you kind of the big overview today, and then I'm gonna give you small videos, step-by-step videos on a couple of the ways, the more popular ways that you could do this for yourself. There's also another series on picking fabric and how you choose those fabrics, and there's a couple beginner patterns to get you practicing or to do at least a test project before you cut into your t-shirts, before you cut into the most important garments that you want to create in a memory quilt for yourself. So if you're new to quilting, the quilting is the last step. A quilt is a textile, and there is a quilt top. Then there's a layer of batting or some type of soft and snuggly material in between. And then there's a quilt back. So those 3 layers are stitched together with stitches that go through, they pierce all 3 layers. That is the definition of a quilt. Now you can get crazy, you can have more layers, you can have different types of batting, you can use different type of textile fabrics, but when it comes down to it, a quilt, for our definition, has 3 layers, your quilt top, a batting, and backing. And there are lots of different ways to quilt that quilt, to put those stitches to hold those layers together. So really there's 5 ways. And the first way, maybe the oldest practice in the book, is going to be hand quilting. Hugely time intensive. I suggest that if you want to hand quilt, find an expert, find somebody here on YouTube, find a blogger that hand quilting is their jam, because it is a very fine art to hand quilting. It's time intensive, it's very labor intensive. I would say of all the quilting methods, hand quilting is by far the most intense method you could choose. So if you want that, some basic tools, you're gonna need a hoop, you're gonna need a thimble, you're gonna need a needle, you're gonna need thread, and then you're gonna have to have that quilt sandwich. So all 3 layers sandwiched together and held by safety pins. So hand quilting is not my forte. I am not gonna dive into that one as deeply. Then you have tie quilting, and I have a whole blog post on all 5 of these methods too if you want to refer back to it, quiltspluslove.com. So tie quilting is probably the least labor intensive method, and because it's fast, it's easy. You put little knots with embroidery thread and you space them about 5 inches apart. 5 inches is general spacing to keep your batting intact. So the structural integrity of your batting requires that it has some type of support within certain dimensions, within certain spacing. Most batting, if you're going with a cotton or a poly cotton blend, you're gonna need a quilting about every 5 inches. So if you choose to tie quilt with embroidery thread, you'll wanna put those knots about every 5 inches. Now, what I will say about tie quilting though, probably the least sophisticated method, and that's okay. Tie quilting has been used for years. It can be very beautiful. It can be very nicely done. I would just say though, with a t-shirt quilt, you're gonna have to pierce through those t-shirts, and ties are a lot thicker than thread. So it wouldn't be my first preference with a t-shirt quilt, especially since if you didn't want to pierce through your t-shirts, the size of our t-shirt quilt blocks are usually larger than 5 inches. So it's not gonna offer the stability and the structure to your quilt that you're looking for a t-shirt quilt. It is an option, you can do it, totally fine, it just wouldn't be my recommendation. Okay, so moving forward then, we have domestic quilting, or a quilting on your domestic sewing machine. You've probably seen straight line quilting. super popular. It's really modern right now, so it's trending as far as straight line quilting goes. Pretty easy to do. If you have a walking foot and your sewing machine, you can do it. I will demonstrate how to straight line quilt in a separate video just so you get an overall, and I'm actually going to be using these pieces. We'll do that here in just a few minutes, but it'll be a separate video. Straight line quilting can have great effects. It can offer a beautiful texture to your finished quilt as long as those lines are within that boundary that your batting needs to stay together. You don't have to do a whole huge amount of quilting on your quilt. So you can get fantastic results. If you want to go a step further than straight line quilting and maybe you want to practice a little first, but you want to get adventurous, there's free motion quilting on your domestic sewing machine. And before I bought my long arm, I free motion quilted so many quilts on my domestic sewing machine. I'm going to show you how. We're going to use the gloves. I'm going to spray baste my quilt top together. That way I can show you. It'll be a little practice quilt, but that way I can show you how to do it because it's really not as scary as you think it would be. And it can be so much fun. It's so enjoyable. I definitely recommend you give it a try. If you have quilted, haven't quilted, you can straight line quilt, but you want a little something extra. Free motion quilting on your domestic sewing machine at home is an amazing option. Try it. So then the fifth way to quilt a quilt, you know, in the industry, we kind of joke that it's quilting by credit card, but that would be to send your quilt out to a long armer. So a long arm quilter is somebody that drives a long arm machine, and I'm sure you've seen them in my videos. I use a long arm. I personally don't quilt for hire because I just have so much other stuff going on. I don't have the time to quilt for hire. But there are a lot of long arm quilters that quilt for hire, and the work is just, it's beautiful. It is amazing. It's an art form in itself, but it can be costly. It can be pricey, and justifiably so. I think if you acquire that level of skill, that level of expertise, and you can create such beautiful work, they deserve, they absolutely deserve what they make because it is a whole nother level. So if you don't want to quilt it yourself, if you are maybe nervous to actually do the quilting, send it out. And I would say kind of the distinction for some people to choose whether they're going to send a quilt out versus do it at home is how important is this quilt to you? You know, if you have an accident in the quilting process, how devastating is that going to be to you? Is it worth the additional expense to send it out? That, or, you know, is this a show quilt? Is this an heirloom keepsake quilt that you want to you want it to be magnificent? Then find a reputable and skilled long arm quilter and send it out. It's totally worth doing it. So with that, that's the 5 methods for quilting your quilt. I'm going to link to the tutorial videos on how to straight line quilt on your domestic sewing machine and how to free motion quilt on your domestic sewing machine here. If you want to see what a long arm looks like, I'll just kind of add a link, or not add a link, I will add a little clip to that here to the end of the video because it is kind of cool to watch, but maybe not accessible necessarily to the first time quilter. So I will see you in our next tutorial. For more tips, more tutorials, and of course, free patterns to get you started on your way quilting, find us at quiltspluslove.com.